Good morning or afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the world. It's great to be here talking to all of you. So I'm in New York now. So I just had my morning coffee at 6:30 a.m. So I am ready to rock and roll. So again, it's great to be here and talk with you for a little while about a topic that is very, very near and dear to my heart. And that is the merging, I call it PsychTech, and that is the psychology of technology. And why I find this very, very fascinating is for a couple of reasons. First of all, I've had an academic and professional career that has kind of always been focused on these two areas. So psychology is in what the white collar criminal and fraud, and all aspects of that, working for several companies, all the way starting as an investigator, and working my way through that aspect of it, but also the academics and technology. So I've always been engulfed in technology, and what I really see is that these things are coming together, as you see in kind of my visual here. It's a wave where you have all this technology on the left, right? But then what's so important is to understand the question of, well, how is this changing us? Okay, so I've done a lot of research. It's just an area I've always had an interest in anyway, of how technology is actually changing people, changing people's behavior at many different levels. But what's interesting is when I insert that back into my area of expertise, which is fraud detection, criminals, white collar criminals, what I find is, firstly, there's hardly any research done in this area. So I always feel like, I feel proud adding at least some knowledge base to those like yourself that are out doing this every day in different capacities, different countries, and different types of companies. And what's interesting though is that if we understand a little bit about how technology is changing people's behavior, then we translate that into how that technology is changing the fraudsters' behavior. Then what we can do is we can develop strategies, stronger strategies, in exactly the area that we are in our world, in our technology spaces, to help fight and prevent that. And that's key, because these types of criminals are different. We talk about, when I talked about fraud fighting even a few years ago, it changed. I look at some of my presentations that I did, going back, I did, just looked at one I did 3 years ago, and I mean, it has changed drastically, because the way we look at criminals has to change, because our criminals are changing, our criminals are evolving. And unfortunately, we see that right now, with the global pandemic now. I mean, the fraud and the scams are just, it's absolutely astronomical. I mean, there are so many scams going on right now. So basically what I want to focus on here today is a way that we can develop an awareness. I want to talk a little bit, I'm going to start with talking about technology, the way trajectory the world is going. And then what I'm going to do is get into psychology. I'm going to discuss a little bit about the different criminological theories and approaches, and then we're going to bring all that together into preventative efforts. Okay, so that's the kind of the roadmap that we're going to take here today. So basically, the trajectory here we're seeing is with all the connected devices that are in the world, and the issue here is going to be, again, focusing on the data that is going to be in circulation. Okay, so all of these billion devices, and these are, phones, iPads, wearables. These devices all will be putting data to us, right? Data in our respective spaces. Data for us to use and leverage, which is a good thing, but also on the negative side of that, data that is also available to the criminal element and to the fraudsters to manipulate. Okay, so this is one thing very, very important, very, very impactful. So right here, what I usually show is some very interesting videos on technology and what it's doing to people. So if you could just visualize for a second, And maybe you have all seen this, people texting, looking at their phones, walking into a light post, right? Or there's actually one of an individual, falling into a manhole. Okay, so what's interesting about this is a very, very extreme example of a basic funny example of what technology is doing to people. But the point that I like to make in showing those videos is the fact that everyone is in that mode, right? We are in a distracted state. We are constantly engulfed in our phones and in our technologies. I mean, there's very, very disturbing studies showing now that phones are like an addiction. They create that chemical connection. So if you are not on your phone, it's almost like you are, you have the same cognitive propensities as an addict to a substance. So these are very interesting studies that I've seen in this area. But what that's doing is that technology is changing the way that we behave as people. Okay, and here in this slide, what you see is you see that there is just so much information that's in the world. I've read some interesting statistics stating that there's been more information and data put into the world in the last 2 years than every single time in history prior. Okay, so more in 2 years than all other years combined. That is an astronomical number. So again, the idea is with what we're talking about in all the other sessions here in these last few days, it's all about this information and trying to manage it and manipulate it. But what it's doing to us as people is also different because it's creating a different type of fraudster. So what I want to do is in that beginning section, again, this is going on our roadmap. Okay, so on the left side here, we talked about technology, right? So hopefully we have at least an understanding now of the way the world is going, the trajectory, all these studies that I am seeing. There is no sign at all of any reduction in devices, in data. So this is going to keep on this trajectory for, in my opinion, a very, very long time. Until maybe implosion, I don't know. but until then, technology is here. We know it. This is what we deal with on a daily basis, is trying to manage all the data that's in circulation. Okay, so with that understanding, what I'd like to do now is focus on the psychological elements. So what we're going to do first is discuss some basic psychological elements of behavior. Okay, what drives behavior, and then we're going to translate that into kind of the preventative aspects of what we can do to try to put a lid, if you will, on the new age criminal. So what I want to talk about now in this next section is psychology. Okay, so basically when we talk of psychology and trying to understand people and people's behavior, and this is really important when you are looking at developing, a strong fraud strategy, and even when we get into discussions on building models, if you will, you have to be able to predict certain types of behavior, but it's also important to provide some parameters of prediction, right? So how do you develop parameters without knowing what your threats are, right? So if you're looking at developing fraud models, this is very, very important. You have to know what your threat is. You have to start at the back end, understand your threat, and then work forward almost in developing your models, right? So one way to do that is to understand one way to understand, even one step further, what your threat is to understand what motivates them, what makes them focus on fraud, and specifically on fraud within your respective areas. And one thing we do is we're going to step way back and talk about behavior in a sense of criminological behavior. So criminology, of course, studies behavior and why criminals do what they do. So this is an area that I've spent pretty much my whole academic career. And what we do when we focus on criminological theory is we look at 3 different schools of thought. So what I want to do is I want to just briefly go over these schools. And the reason why is because these frame, and every single other criminal area, terrorism, extortion, kidnapping, homicide, juvenile delinquency, in those areas, those criminal areas, what we do is we look at the typology of the person based on these three schools of thought. And once we identify which school of thought applies to that particular situation, that helps us understand more, because there's studied, research, developed theories, specific theories within each of these schools that we can use to help with our preventative efforts. Okay, so back probably starting 15 years ago, when I started to merge, academics and fraud in my fraud fighting, this is what I did. I basically sat down and I looked at these three schools and I studied these at length and said, okay, which one of these would apply in our setting, in our counter fraud setting? Okay, so if we walk through these very, very quickly, all right, so when we look at the biological theories of crime causation, basically what they say is they say that crime is caused by each school says crime is caused by certain factors. People behave a certain way, okay? So when we talk about the biological school, we're gonna go through each of these three quickly. So biological school. So biological school, as it sounds, means basically that behavior is driven by biological inborn factors, okay? So when we think of that, think of yourself, think of your friends, think of your family, and how they behave a certain way, okay? So biological studies focus on, let's say, genetics. There's certain anomalies, certain brainwave studies I see that show that serial killers have certain brain maps different than others. So these are biological theories, and a lot of that, I use the analogy of coffee, or even any other substance, how people react differently to that, right? So how many of you, can have a cup of coffee right before bed, a triple espresso at Starbucks and have no problem, right? How many, if they have that, I mean, you're up on emails at 2 a.m., so therein lies the difference, right? We all have different DNA, different genes, and yes, of course, there are some factors such as tolerance and things that go into that, but at its core, it's all about genetics. So genetics drives behavior. So what I have to look at is I say, okay, from a fraud perspective, financial crime perspective, is there anything we can do preventatively that can alter genetics, can alter genetic makeup? No, absolutely not. Maybe the medical field, yes, they could, but not us. We don't have the ability to alter anyone's DNA or genes, right? So none of those schools apply to what we're talking about. So we cross all of those hundreds and hundreds of theories out. Then I say, okay, let's focus on psychological theories. So just as it sounds, psychological theories basically say behavior is driven by psychological factors, okay? So, and specifically bad behavior is driven by mental flaws and deficiencies, okay? So let's say, your serial killers, your Jeffrey Dahmers, your Manson, those people have very, very, very deep psychological flaws. And even to a certain extent, as I mentioned earlier, your Madoffs and your different bucketed of white collar criminals, your Holmes, they have certain psychological factors that are inborn, highly competitive, highly egotistical. They have mental flaws and mental deficiencies. Okay, so when then I translate that into fraud detection, I say, okay, in the fraud world, is there anything we can do from a preventative effort to alter an individual's behavior from a psychological perspective? Okay, no, we can't adjust mental flaws, right? It's impossible to do that, right? So none of those schools apply. So we're left with the sociological school. Now, just as the sociological school sounds, sociological school focuses on environmental factors that contribute to behavior. Now, this, in my opinion, when I started to look at it, is absolutely applicable to what we're dealing with in our financial fraud industry, okay? Because I am a firm believer in what I call opportunity theory, okay? That when opportunity is presented to an individual, they will take advantage of that, okay? If the opportunity wasn't there in the first place, they might not, okay? So what the sociological school focuses on is it proposes different types of theories based on environmental factors, push and pull factors that actually contribute to fraud behavior, okay? And specifically, this applies in our current trajectory of technology and what we're all dealing with in our, ML/AI space, because it's all about the bringing together, like I mentioned, of technology and these environmental factors. So I'm going to explain that a little bit further. So now, basically, in criminological theory perspective, sociological schools explain 100% the financial fraud criminal and exactly why they do what they do. So let's explore that a little bit deeper. So Chris says in his day he had to walk 20 miles in the snow. Okay, so this is the old criminal right here. This is even just a few years ago. Okay, so this is the new age criminal. Okay, this is the criminal we're faced with now, and a lot of companies I see are still focused on those older, walking through the snow preventative efforts, when this is what we need to focus on. Okay. So when we look at the different theories, okay, so these are the sociological theories. There's hundreds of them that are out there, and some of you might have a background in criminology, criminal justice. Some of these might seem familiar to you. There's hundreds of them out there. Now, there are 4 or 5 I feel personally that are highly applicable to our world. So I'm just going to go through these very quickly. Feel free to research these on your own, or you can message me later. If you want, any expansion or increased, articles or anything on these. So strain entitlement theory, again, these are all sociological theories. So Breaking Bad, if anyone has ever watched that, what you see great frustration with certain people, all right? And these individuals can't obtain goals through normal means, right? So they resort to white collar crime, they resort to fraud to satisfy that, because fraud is easy, quote unquote, okay? So we are all easy targets in our space because we have tons of money, right? We are the financial fraud sector, right? Finance is in our names, in our industry. So criminals are drawn to that, right? But what this says, this theory states that people focus on fraud simply because they have that strain. They don't want to go through normal means like we did, went to school, became professionals. They want to resort to fraud because it's easy to obtain the same things that we have, whether it's going to college, sending our kids to college, getting a car, a house, whatever that is, okay? So those environmental factors are pushing this type of behavior, okay? Rational choice. Now, this is very, very, very important. This, in my opinion, is probably the most important to remember. Rational choice theory states that basically people make decisions when they weigh risk and reward, right versus wrong. Now, here's what's interesting about the white collar criminals. Studies show that they are more cognitive than other criminals, okay, that they are smarter, even though I hate to give credit there, they are smarter than other criminals. So what that means is that they can make a decision between right and wrong. And that's very important as we start to talk about prevention in a minute, because your efforts will absolutely pay off. In other areas, let's say, I mentioned before extortion, let's say. Well, actually, criminals in that field are slightly smarter as well. But let's say another industry, let's say juvenile delinquency, where they don't have the cognitive ability to make right and wrong decisions. Preventative efforts are not going to be the same, okay? So your efforts, they can actually think. These fraudsters can think. They stop and think and can say, yes, you know what? This is worth it. This is not worth it. This is worth it to be law-abiding and not violate this policy or condition, or they can go the other path. So preventative efforts 100% work according to the academic research that is out there that we just kind of very quickly walk through. Studies show that they are rational. They can make a choice between right and wrong. So your preventative efforts will absolutely help them do that. Justification, this is also big too, because a lot of fraudsters feel they are justified, right? Whether it's internal, in the Meet the Speakers, I had a question about sales managers and fraud. And this is huge for sales managers because they might feel like they're overworked, right? Well, how did they get even? Well, they got passed up for a promotion, but guess what? Now they're going to justify that by padding an expense account, okay? Internal fraud. So these are areas we need to focus on when we're building building our models. But this is all part of those sociological perspectives, those environmental factors. Okay, so justification is in my opinion another very, very important sociological factor. Deterrence theory is big. There's very little deterrence in our industry, and we know that across the board, whether you're dealing in different countries, in different regions. You know, those that have stronger regulatory environments, you're going to see less fraud with those, you know, because it's a higher deterrent. Studies specifically unequivocally support that, okay, that when you have higher deterrence, then fraud actually goes down. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of support in this area. So this is an area where, you know, we could potentially focus on. But here's what you can do within your respective departments and divisions and even your companies. You know, I have kind of a saying we have a saying in the outdoors, you know, you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun your friend. Okay, so basically what it's saying is we're not pitting each other against each other, because we're all, you know, in the same community, if you will. But if you make yourself a harder target, the fraudsters will go elsewhere. Absolutely. Okay, whether it's even within your company, you know, do not make yourself a vulnerable target, and they will look elsewhere. They do not want to make it. They don't want to do extra work to scam you. You know, whether it's anything from you know, very high-end hacking to very you know, lower end on the claims platform or financial fraud platform. Okay, so deterrence theory actually is very, very important in our realm in developing your counter fraud strategies. There's another example of the new and old age criminal. The guy on the right, bank robbery 2015. Just wants to make sure you're using the right passwords. Okay, so here's the difference. Okay, and again, all our strategies have to also change as well. All right, so now what I want to do in the last little section here. So we talked about the you know, trajectory of technology. We talked about psychology. So we have an understanding now of kind of what the motivational factors are behind these criminals. Now, what we have to do now is we have to try to leverage that, right? So we talked very early on about technology and how there's all that data available, right? So we have to utilize that data to our advantage, because our scammers are, our fraudsters are, right? So how do we do that? Well, at the end of the day, one of the ways we can do that, and this is where, so now what we're getting into in our discussion here this morning is talking about prevention, what you can do with all this stuff that we talked about, right? So one of the ways that some of the successful companies utilize what's called a behavioral bridge. And what that is basically is you're taking what I call behavioral pattern predictors, and you're developing strategies, okay? So a lot of times, what you can't do is you can't profile an individual person, right? Because of the strict volume that we have. It's very difficult to do that, especially in the world that we are in of technology, right? But what we can do is we can pattern a specific behavior, right? If we know that 10 frauds happened based on this behavior in the past, or based on our intelligence from external sources, then we can develop a prediction on that behavior. And that's what we look to do when we develop models in fraud, right? Is we look to develop a pattern. If a certain person logs in at a certain time, this person has certain background, and the IP address is not the same as this. So these are all behavior pattern predictors, right? Now, there's ways to do that. And of course, the way what you need to do that is data, right? So we already talked about the data that's available. So here's what I would recommend is you know, as part of a you know, a consultation piece, risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, whatever you're doing as part of your strategy, is to look at the data that's available. That's always what I recommend. I'm going through a couple of exercises right now on that. I'm actually involved in one today on life insurance, and this is what we're doing. We're identifying the data that's available, and then we're going to work backwards and look at how we can develop that into the model. You know, we're looking firstly at internal data. What does this company have for internal data, and what can we use and leverage? And here's what's interesting. This is what we're doing. We're actually using data from other departments, right? We're using data from, so this is a claim operation. We're using data we're gathering from sales and underwriting. And we're looking at that onboarding process, and we're looking to see what data we can extract from that, and how that compares to certain data that were submitted at a later time with the claim. So we're looking at the accuracy and determining if there's any anomalies there. So that's just the first step. We're then going to look at what external data sources are available and see how we can supplement that. So first thing to do, like I said, is to identify, if there's any behavior pattern predictors that you can actually leverage. So for example, here's just a very quick list here of some data that you can use is your FICO scores, of course, if they're available, any bankruptcies, liens and judgments, because what that's going to do, even though that's not going to be an indicator of fraud, that's going to be a push factor. When I talked about that strain theory explains behavior using bankruptcies and liens because that creates the strain, right? It creates the motivational factors, right? All of these things do. They create financial difficulties, which could create a push factor. Now, if you have an opportunity within your department or division or your company, then that fraudster is going to take advantage of that, okay? So here's something interesting towards the bottom. We talk about recently unemployed or recent health diagnosis. Now, these bottom two, I inputted in here because these were based on actual scenarios where the company had unemployment data in a whole other department division, and we were able to just kind of bridge that towards the application and fraud that we were looking to do. Health diagnosis, same thing. That was in a totally other division. So if you have like different lines of business or different applications or different departments, I would absolutely explore what data is within those other departments and how you can map those into your own divisions and departments for your use. So definitely focus on the data sources themselves and the predictions that you can use, and once you bring those data sources together. So here is my when I teach on ground at the college level, students come in and a lot of times they say, hey, professor, I have only 2 minutes. What do I need to know? Well, this is my money slide, I call it. Okay, so this is my slide that really I would love for everyone to focus on, and that is reducing opportunity. Try to reduce opportunity as much as you can, right? No matter where you are, what division you're in or department, if you reduce that opportunity, I guarantee you those fraudsters will look elsewhere, okay? So first thing to do is look at where they're exploiting your weaknesses, your system of controls. Where is it? It could be in onboarding. It could be anywhere within your ecosystem. It could be at the back end after, settlement or whatever the final point of your business process is. It could be at that very end point. It could be internal. And that's why, again, developing the models that you're all focused on is very, very important to focus on what areas could be of weakness to you. And then identifying those vulnerabilities, and then again, developing those key strategies to try to send them elsewhere. As I show that visual on the top there with the doors you see, I mean, that's what you don't want, because that's the door the scammer is going to go in. He's not going to try to even open the other few doors, right? He's going to go in the door that's open. So try to shut all the doors and send the fraudsters elsewhere, but try to reduce opportunity in as many places as you can. And a lot of that comes from a vulnerability assessment or a risk assessment. Training and awareness, believe it or not, that has, it's a very grassroots approach, but even creating awareness within your respective spaces, your divisions, departments, your operational level folks, creating that awareness and having joint meetings with those different departments will absolutely help to try to identify those new vulnerabilities, those new areas that, again, you can generate into a feedback loop, I call it, when you're into the ML AI space and you're in those digital platforms and developing them. Now, counter fraud efforts, they have to have certain factors in them, and these are ones that we focus on at all levels. You know, having detection as quickly as possible, identifying those, whatever systems you're dealing with. If you can identify that fraud quickly and get them to the right people so they can take action, that has an absolute deterrent effect. Secondly, zero tolerance. Make sure there's an accurate policy in place where the fraudsters know that they're going to have a hard time if they go to you. And also creating a face to the fraud. This is very important because what technology is doing is creating that detachment, like I mentioned earlier. So there's no victim, right? And studies show when someone doesn't identify with the victim, they're more likely to precipitate in that crime. So if there's no victim, like I talked about those no-touch claims, then that person will more than likely not feel bad about committing that crime, committing that scam, because there's no victim. There's no person that they can identify with. So through that digitalization process, if you're involved in that, definitely be forewarned, because with that digitalization process, you have that higher volume, but you also have those no touch points, and that's going to create more fraud because of that victimless environment, that victimless mentality. Okay, so definitely make sure you have an eye on that. What I call the human aspect of that. And lastly, I just want to make sure I talk about this a little bit, so because I know we only have a few minutes left, is talking about technology, leveraging technology. Now, I started with technology, the trajectory that's out there, and I'd like to end in that, because yes, technology is growing. Yes, it's going to be, also it's going to be a threat, as I mentioned, but it's also going to be an incredible opportunity for us. This is all the space that we're dealing with. This is what this conference is about. The other sessions are about, are ways to leverage technology and what we do. And this is what, as a consultant with Inform, this is what I love about what I do, is because we actually, I go into companies per se, after working 20 years in the industry, and then leveraging technology, which I didn't have 20 years ago when I started, but using the technology and those platforms that are out there, instead of having 5 analysts sorting through data, now you can have one good analyst that's really good with technology and a platform. I mean, this is huge, being able to mine through this data and get to the core of those key frauds, those key cases that are important, that you can have the most impact on. And that's the key, because we can absolutely leverage this technology. The anti-fraud programs that are out there, I don't know, whatever systems you're using, it could be internally based, it could be externally based. Those systems can absolutely be leveraged with the knowledge of how to optimize those systems within your division. So they have to be fitted correctly, right? They have to be able to mold to your specific scenarios and your lines of business. But technology, again, it's going to be a threat. The scammers and fraudsters are out there using those, but we can 100% combat that with the technology that we have. So I think that brings me to only about a minute left. So here's my contact information. If anyone has any follow-up questions on any of this, I'd love to talk about this topic of merging of technology and the trajectory we're going into psychology of kind of where the world is from a behavioral perspective, and then loop that back into prevention. So doing things at a preventative level to leverage the information we know about how behavior is now, and focus on reducing opportunity. That I would say would be the #1 takeaway that I'd like to leave you with, is try to focus on those areas of reduction, and you're absolutely going to see some results. So I'd like to thank you, everyone, and please feel free to follow up with me if you have any questions later. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And my colleagues Roy and Kevin are speaking next as well, so look forward to that as well. So thank you.